Okay, today we're going to talk about the process for researching and writing essays at the college level. So I like to call this the crash course in essay writing, and I do this for a very specific purpose. When I first started teaching, I had just come out of graduate school, and in graduate school, for the history discipline, you have to write at least a 20-page essay for every class that you take, and you take about 9 or 10 classes. So by the time I got through with graduate school, I had written, uh, 200 pages or so of essays just to get through that program. So I first came out of graduate school, and to me, writing essays was kind of second nature by that point because I had done it so much in the past few years before I started teaching. Therefore, when I first started teaching, I assumed that everyone else in colleges knew how to write essays and they view it as kind of second nature. So when I first started, my first class I ever taught, I assigned a term paper and just assumed that the students knew how to do that. So I just gave them a due date for the final draft, and that was it. And that didn't turn out too well because I quickly learned that a lot of students don't know how to do research and write essays, or they haven't taken English classes yet that often teach them that process. So after a couple years of kind of struggling with trying to figure out why students don't like writing essays or they feel it's a giant chore that they don't want to do, I found out that they're just kind of mystified about the whole process, and few people have ever tried to take the time to explain the process to them. So at that point, I took one of the normal lectures out of this course, out of the series, and I replaced it with what you're watching now is the crash course in essay writing, which is exactly what it sounds like. In the next hour or so, we're going to go through all the basic steps of creating an essay from the very first step all the way through turning in the final draft and proofreading. So I learned a lot from students my first few years teaching because, again, to me, writing essays was second nature, and I actually like writing essays because it helps me kind of put my ideas in order and it forces me to find evidence for my beliefs. So when I first started teaching, I was somewhat mystified why students don't enjoy writing essays or they find it to be a tedious chore that they hate doing. And after a while, I just flat out started asking students, why do you hate doing this so much? And a lot of students told me that their experience with writing essays is that they end up really sitting down at their computer to write something, and they end up staring at this. They're just their Word document, um, and they kind of sit there and they feel like this cursor is just kind of blinking at them, kind of like insulting them, saying, like, why aren't you writing anything? Why aren't you writing anything? Over and over and over again. And the students told me that that's really their experience with writing is that they sit down to write their essay and they write a sentence and then they want to change their sentence around and they don't know what to write next. And that's what really revealed to me the problem is that a lot of students sit down to write their essay before they have any plan of what they want to say. And that's going to be the most difficult way of writing an essay because if you just sit down to write it sentence by sentence and then try to build those into paragraphs, you're not going in with any kind of game plan for what you want to accomplish and how you're going to do it. So, of course, when you sit down to do that, you're just kind of in the dark and you're just kind of, feeling around for things, trying to figure out where the ideas are and what you want to emphasize. So, of course, if you sit down to write it like that, you're only going to write like one page every 3 hours or something because you're building it in your mind as you're typing it into the page. And that's just the most tedious and difficult way to possibly do it. A much better way is to come up with a plan before you sit down to write a draft. So, a lot of students told me that when they sit down to write something and they don't know what they want to say yet, they end up just kind of staring at their computer for a long time and getting frustrated and feeling confused. Or even worse, they start getting very angry at their computer and they start to really hate the assignment. And even worse, they might hate the person who assigned them the assignment, which is all these kind of things that we want to avoid by the end of today. So after watching this whole video, you should understand much better that sitting down to write your draft, your rough draft, is one of the very last stages in the whole process. And there's a whole lot of work you have to put in before you sit down to write your rough draft in order to, go through the process kind of the easier way, the more logical way, and have a better outcome, end up with a better essay at the end. So what's the first step you ever have to do to take in writing an essay? Well, your first step is to do what you've really already done by this point, and that's choose a topic. So like we've talked about before, your best option is, if you have no idea what you want to write about for this history class, just kind of skim through the syllabus and look at the lecture series and try to pick out something that might interest you. And I would have helped you refine it by now. So by the time you're watching this video, you should have a pretty strong idea of what your topic is, well narrowed down to a topic that is doable for you in the next couple of months. So now that you have your topic, the next step is to start looking for resources, research sources on your topic. And back in the olden days, when some of us were in college, we used to go into the college book stacks in the college library and literally go find the stack that has the books on our topic, and just start going through the books and looking to see if there's any particular book in there that would be useful for your topic. So like we've talked about before, if you're trying to do research on some battle in World War II, you basically go to the section of the library that has the World War II stuff, and usually they'll have like one shelf that's the military history section that talks about the battles and how one side won and whatnot. So you would basically, take out one of these little chair things on the floor, one of these little stands, and you would sit down in front of that shelf and you'd start looking at the books. And you would want to look at very specific things in one book after another to try to determine which of these books is going to be useful for your essay. So the first thing you want to think about when you pick off one of these books off the shelf, you should look at the table of contents. Because if you're pulling a book of military history for all of World War II off the shelf, but you only want to write about a specific battle, you might look in the table of contents and maybe there's just one chapter that talks about that battle. And the other chapters talk about other battles. So for instance, this image you're seeing here, this is a table of contents for a book about the revolutions within the Spanish Empire in the early 1800s. So that's a gigantic topic, just like all of World War II is a gigantic topic. So if you were doing the history of the revolution in Venezuela, and you're looking at this table of contents, you would go down to number 4 at the bottom, and you see that there's this one chapter on just Venezuela. And you look across, and it starts on page 109, ends on page 123. That's only 14 pages. So that's pretty good. And that also means that this could be a really good book for you to check out because it has a dedicated chapter to your topic. And it also means you probably don't have to read all those other pages before page 109. You might be able to go just right to that chapter and only read that chapter of that book to, get as much information on the revolution in Venezuela as you'll need for just your essay. So the table of contents in these books can be very, very, very useful. If the table of contents is very general or you're not kind of getting much information out of it, another source you can go to is to flip to the back of the book where it usually has a thing called an index. And an index is a list of topics in alphabetical order that tells you where that topic is discussed in the book. So this is the first page of an index from that same Latin American Revolutions book. So if you're interested in a specific battle or a specific leader or general for your topic, you might just look up their name in the index. And like this very first thing in the index, absolutism, you can see there's a whole bunch of different numbers listed next to it. When you're looking at an index and trying to figure out if this is a useful book for you, if I'm researching absolutism in early Latin America, I might check out this book because you can see that there's several sections that the book talks about absolutism for several pages. So there's maybe a lot of good information in there. But if I'm researching absolutism and I don't even see that listed in the index, it means that the book doesn't talk about it. So, put that book back on the shelf. That's not going to be useful for your research. Just like if you're researching a battle or the Venezuelan Revolution, you look in the table of contents and there's nothing on that, maybe this isn't a good book for you to use. If some books don't even have an index, most scholarly books should, but some don't. And some of the table of contents really aren't really that detailed, so maybe you can't figure out if this is a good book for you to read. The next thing that you might look at doing is go back to the contents page and look at the introduction and maybe read the introduction. You can see in this book on early Latin American history, the revolutions, the introduction is probably only about 6 pages. It starts on page 1, chapter 1 starts on page 7, so the introduction is probably only 6 pages, not that long. Most introductions in scholarly books aren't that long. Maybe they might go up to 15 or 20 pages. But one thing that introductions very often do in scholarly works, especially toward the end of an introduction, the last few pages, will tell you a chapter by chapter breakdown of what that chapter's about and what the main arguments are. So if you can't kind of glean from the table of contents or the index themselves if this is going to be a good book for you, maybe just read the last part of the introduction, and that might tell you right there in a few paragraphs what the chapters are about, and you might be able to take a good guess whether or not you want to check this book out. So those are 3 things you really want to look at to decide if the book that you're looking at on the shelf is going to be useful for you. Today is a very different kind of day and age for scholarly research. You will often, especially with online-only courses, if you're not physically going to the campus, you might often be working with online databases in the library to access scholarly journal articles or ebooks or something like that, electronic sources. And those can be easy also because you can often download those sources into a PDF right to your computer. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you open up a PDF and you can hit Control F on your keyboard and that'll open a dialog box somewhere, a search box, where you can basically do like a Google search. Just type in the name of the battle or whatever your topic is, or the name of the general, or whatever, and just do a term search and it'll search the whole document. If it's an ebook, it might search the whole book. And all you can do is just look at how many times that term pops up, how many hits you get basically, and that'll tell you right there if that book or article is going to be useful for you without having to read the whole thing. If you're trying to research a certain battle and you do a term search in the article, the ebook you have, and you only get 1 hit, that means that term only pops up 1 time in all those pages that you've got, so it might not be a very good one for you to use. If you get 10 or 20 or 30 hits or more, that might be a much better article or book for you to use because it talks about your topic a lot. So that's an even quicker way in this kind of electronic day and age to do a real quick kind of analysis of each source to figure out whether or not you want to use it in your research. This takes a long time. This takes usually several days all by itself to maybe go through the shelf of books in the library or to go through your electronic versions, and you usually want to pick out a good 5 to 10 sources to start to read. And that'll take you quite a while, at least several hours all by itself, just to build that list of sources to read. Um, and then you actually have to read them. And if it's a journal article or a book chapter, those are very often 20 or 30 pages. And if you're reading, 5 to 10 of those, one thing you really want to do is take very detailed notes about what you're reading. Because if you're reading, 5 to 10 book chapters or journal articles on generally the same topic, what you'll find is that they talk about pretty much the same events, usually the same people. Each historian who writes a different book has a different interpretation of it. But you want to make sure to take very detailed notes of exactly what you're reading, because after you read a few of them that talk about the same events, what will happen is that it all becomes a kind of soup in your mind, and you'll forget which chapter said what and which historian said what, and that can be very problematic for you because eventually you're going to have to pull quotes out of this stuff to prove your ideas. So you want to take very detailed notes about what you've been reading, and I can show you uh, this is a just one page out of my notes out of a book I read about Andrew Jackson, a U.S. president in the 1800s, and you can see that I write down the details of what is being discussed on these pages, what the main arguments are, in my own words. And if I read a 30-page article or book chapter, I usually end up with a good 5 to 10 pages of single-spaced notes because there's going to be a lot of ideas in there. And I find it really helps me to write down all these ideas, and you can even see at the end of each little kind of paragraph, there's a page number there. And there's also a letter. It says B7 at the top one. That means that these ideas appear at the bottom of page 7 because I'm so kind of obsessed with efficiency now. If I go back into my notes, I want to find exactly where that discussion is. I don't even want to have to read all of page 7 again. I want to go right to the bottom of it and find it. And the one after that, at the end of that one, it says bottom of page 7 to top of page 8. And you see the next one, middle of page 9, then bottom of page 9, then bottom of 9 to top of 10. So I take very detailed notes to the point where I basically have a map of all the important ideas in my notes by the time I'm done reading that article or book chapter or whatever it is. Because once you read all that stuff and you take that detailed level of notes, really you just start skimming through your notes to figure out what you have to say about this topic and what you've learned, what you think is the most important stuff. But reading through a good 5 to 10 articles or book chapters and taking this level of detailed notes takes a very long time. So the mass majority of time that you spend in working on this term paper is going to be just basic research, just going to the sources. And that's the same for all historians. We all spend about 90%, 90, of all the work that we put into this thing just in basic research. And yes, that's the answer to number 2. And this is true from you being introductory history students in this course all the way up to the highest levels of scholarship. The people who spend years writing the books that you're going to be reading chapters of or that you're going to find on the bookshelf in the library. A lot of them, the big books, 700-800 page books or whatever, they take 10 years to write. And very often they'll spend 9 out of those 10 years just in basic research. And then they'll spend 1 year kind of outlining their ideas and writing their draft. So right up to the highest level of scholarship, the professional historians working at the biggest name institutions in the world, the Harvards and Yales and USCs and UCLAs of the world, they're going through the same process. They're planning to write books that are hundreds of pages long instead of you writing a 4 or 5 page essay. So they're putting more research time into it, so it takes them longer. But it's the exact same process. So that's one really important thing to remember as you go through the process. the mass majority of time that you're going to spend on it is just in the basic research, finding the sources, going through the sources, taking notes, and thinking about it. All right, so moving on from here. After you've taken all of your notes and you've read all the sources, your next step is to sit down and think to yourself, well, what do I have to say about this topic? What have I learned? What do I want to write about, really? And at that point, you're going to start planning out your essay by creating what I call an outline of ideas. And the outline has really three big important. The first piece that you see here is called a thesis. And a thesis is your general statement to the reader that will appear in the beginning of your essay eventually. This is what my essay is about. And usually a thesis has kind of 2 or 3 or 4 major subtopics. And as you'll see with this essay I wrote on George Washington about his farewell address, kind of his advice to the country about how they should run their government as he's retiring. He's not going to be around anymore. So he's kind of telling the American people, these are the things you should watch out about regarding government for the future. So I wrote an essay, I think it was 5 or 6 pages on George Washington's farewell address years ago, and I made an outline of my ideas before I sat down to actually type it up. So my thesis was, Washington's speech was fairly long, and I picked out the 3 most important things that I thought were in the speech that Americans should remember today. And so my thesis is that Washington said in his farewell address that the most important things we should remember is we should watch the power of our government, what he called the kind of unity of our government. We should resist creating political parties, which is kind of a joke now, obviously, and even bigger and even worse joke is that we should avoid war and national debt as much as possible. So my essay argued that those were his 3 most important arguments that we should remember today. So in my outline, I wrote that down as the thesis. So the thesis is the first step. The next step is to break your thesis apart into the 3 or 4 different major subtopics, because each of those is going to become a body paragraph in your essay. So you can see how I did this by breaking my thesis up into the different body paragraphs, and you can see that body paragraph 1, Washington advised the people to guard the unity of government, is the same as the first argument in the thesis. And body paragraph 2, that he warned us against building political parties, is the same as the second part of the thesis. And body paragraph 3, that we should avoid war and national debt, is really just the third part of the thesis. So you can see I just broke the thesis up into its 3 main subtopics, and because each of those is going to be a body paragraph. And the third big step for an outline, and this is something that no teacher ever taught me, this is something I figured out for myself after 6 or 7 years of college, is to, before I sit down to write my rough draft, I go and find the quotes I'm going to use for each paragraph, the evidence, and I type those into my outline. Because for me, when I'm writing a rough draft, psychologically, I like to feel like the rough draft is going nice and smoothly. I'm not getting hung up or caught up in any details that's slowing me down. So when I sit down to write a rough draft, I like to have my argument lined up. I like to have the evidence ready to go, so that while I'm writing a rough draft, really I have my outline in one document. I just kind of copy the argument, pop it into my new paragraph, kind of explain the argument a little bit, and then I copy my quote, my evidence out of the outline, paste it into the body paragraph, explain the evidence a little bit, and that paragraph's done and I'm on to the next paragraph. The thing I really hate is when I'm trying to write a body paragraph and I pop in the argument and I explain a little bit, and then I have to go back and look in a book or an article or something for the quote I want to use to prove it, because that just feels like it slows me down. So I do all the prep work first. I find all the evidence that I'm going to use, and I put it into my outline so that when I sit down to write a rough draft, I just kind of fly right through it. And these days, when I sit down to write a draft of something that's usually around 20 pages long or so, as long as I have my evidence all lined up and my arguments and everything ready to go in an outline, I can write 20 pages in 3 hours because I'm just going one paragraph into another and I'm just going through my outline basically. So doing all this preparation work for me is key, and I find it really helps me quite a lot. And when you're putting your evidence into your outline, you can decide what is the best evidence to use for this argument. Make sure the evidence doesn't repeat, those types of things. So those are the three big pieces of an outline. You want to have your thesis set. You want to uh, create your body paragraph topics, subtopics, and you want to put your evidence into the outline before you start writing your rough draft. And I'm going to be asking you to turn in provisional outlines in the next few weeks or so that I'm going to review, and that's what I'm going to be looking for. What's your thesis? Do the body paragraphs reflect the thesis in order? And do you have evidence for your body paragraphs, for your subtopics? And while we're talking about all this, the thesis is really a giant key to this whole process, especially for the reader. You really need to have a thesis in the beginning of your rough draft, because a thesis tells the reader what's going to happen. So think of the thesis as like a freeway sign as you're driving down the road that tells you what ideas or what exits are coming up in what order. So, for example, if you're driving down a freeway in a place you've never been, and so you don't have like navigation on your phone or in your car or something, and you're just driving down the road, what happens if there's no freeway signs? You can get lost very, very quickly because you've never been to this place, you don't really know where you're going, and you have nothing to guide you. So those freeway signs are very, very useful because it tells you what exits are coming up in what order, and you really want to you are very reliant on that freeway sign being accurate in telling you what exits are coming up in what order, because if the order that the sign tells you gets mixed up with what the order the streets actually are, then you're in real trouble. And a reader has that exact same feeling if they get through the first paragraph of your essay and there's no thesis. You have to tell the reader what ideas are going to come up in the body paragraphs and in what order, so that as the reader, I read that thesis statement and I say, okay, I now know what's going to happen. And as I go through the body paragraphs, they become very predictable and easy to understand because you told me what's going to happen. So for an essay that has a thesis, they're usually very easy to read, very easy to understand, and therefore they get usually a pretty high grade. And for an essay that does not have a thesis, the reader does not know what's going on in the paragraphs, does not know what's coming up next, does not know the purpose, it just feels lost the whole time, and usually the grade for those kind of essays goes down pretty fast. And a thesis is in the grading rubric for your final draft. So I am actively looking for the thesis when you turn in your final draft as I start to read them. And I'm going to compare your thesis to what the body paragraphs actually do. So a thesis is very, very key for your reader to know where they are in the essay, know what's coming up in what order. So next step is, so for number 4, take a couple minutes or so, pause the video, and try to write a one-sentence thesis for the topic you've chosen. So for whatever stage in the research you're at, you have a topic, just try to write a one-sentence thesis under number 4 that has the kind of subtopics laid out in the order you want to discuss them. So pause the video and try that for a few minutes, and then restart the video once you have your answer written down. Okay, now that you have your thesis ready to go, the thesis really goes in the very first paragraph, what we call the introductory paragraph in an essay. So the very first paragraph usually kind of starts off your essay by giving some background information about your topic for, I don't know, a few sentences. But the real purpose of a first paragraph, an introduction, is to get to the thesis. So a thesis should be there, usually around the end of the introduction, the introductory paragraph. And that's what the reader is really looking for. What is this essay going to do? And after you've got the introduction done with the thesis in there, your next step is to start going through the body paragraphs. And a body paragraph has a pretty specific format that it should really be followed. A body paragraph should have these three pieces in place. It should start off with your statement as the writer. This happened, this is true, whatever your argument is. After that, you should give a quote or some kind of evidence to prove the accuracy of your original statement that started the paragraph. So in the history discipline, we usually use quotes to prove our ideas. So you can quote another historian in one of the books or articles you read. You can quote what we call a primary source, something written in the time that you're studying. Sometimes historians use statistics as evidence. So if your argument in your statement in your body paragraph is, the bubonic plague was really horrible and killed a lot of people. After that, you give a statistic. It killed 1 out of every 3 Europeans in this decade or something like that. And that could act as good enough evidence to prove that argument if it's a kind of statistical argument. After the quote or whatever evidence you use, you have to explain how the evidence proves your statement. So that's really crucial. You have to tell the reader, you have to interpret the evidence for the reader. Tell them what the evidence means. Because you don't want to give an argument and then give the reader some evidence and then just expect the reader to tie those together themselves. You have to explicitly, clearly tell them what that connection is. And a body paragraph really needs these three pieces in this order. You do not want to start your paragraph with a quote. Because if I, as the reader and the grader, start one of your body paragraphs and it starts with a quote, the first question that pops into my mind is, I see evidence. What does this evidence prove? What's the point? Why am I reading this evidence? Why are you telling me this? So a body paragraph has to start with your argument. This is true. This happened. And then give the evidence to prove it. Also, a body paragraph does not want to end with a quote or end with any evidence. Because, again, if I read one of your body paragraphs, here's a quote ends, that's the end of the paragraph. The first question that pops into my mind is, well, what does this quote mean? Explain it to me. Don't trust me to make that connection for you because I might make a different connection than what you want me to make. So don't let the reader kind of in their mind wander off into all these kind of possibilities for what that evidence means. Tie them down to your argument explicitly. Tell them what it means. Don't let them wander off. Keep them tied down to your idea. And we also see this operating in one of the paragraphs I wrote on that essay on Washington. So this is the final body paragraph on his argument about avoiding war and national debt. So in this paragraph, you see it starts off with my statement. This is what Washington warned us about. So Washington's final warning came in two areas he gained a lifetime of experience in: war and national debt. So I just basically argued this is true. This is what he told us. This is what he wanted us to do. Immediately after that, I have this very long quote from Washington's speech in his words that kind of proves the accuracy of my argument. I argued this is what he advised us to do, and here's the quote right from his words to prove it. And after that very long quote, your quotes don't have to be this long. I mean, back in the 1700s, they used to write in very long sentences, very confusing sentences often. So that's a very long quote, but you don't have to use quotes that long for your essay. But right after that quote ends, I have an explanation. I break down that very long quote into my own words to show the connection between the evidence and the argument I gave at the beginning of the paragraph. So that's a body paragraph. I mean, that's half a page right there. And you can see it with the ruler on the left. It started off at the top of the page, and now you're down to what, 5 inches down out of an 8-inch page. So that's a paragraph. I mean, it's really fairly simple, as long as you understand the formula of it. And evidence is absolutely crucial in this whole process. Um, if you don't have evidence, if you don't have a quote or a statistic or something, there's no reason for a reader to believe you. Just like if you run into someone on the street and they say that aliens have invaded and we're all going to be enslaved to the aliens or something like that. If I ran into someone on the street saying that, I mean, they have an argument, aliens have invaded. First thing I would ask for is, okay, what's your proof for this? And if they have no proof, I'm probably not going to believe them. Just like if you run into all kinds of people that want to convince you of something in your life, if they can't prove it, there's no reason to believe them. They could just be, just coming up with stuff, pulling ideas out of thin air and saying, here, believe this. Well, I'm not in the business of just believing things just because you want me to. I'll believe things if you can prove it, and I don't find any contradictory evidence that's even stronger, but we can get into that later. But for these essays, you have to prove your argument. You have to prove your ideas. You can't just give a bunch of ideas in a body paragraph and here you go and expect anyone to believe you. So evidence is absolutely crucial, and your use of evidence is really crucial. So one of the best ways I've ever seen anyone explain how crucial evidence is when I was in college. I had this history professor at UCLA, who told her class, all right, to understand how useful evidence is, just imagine, let's play a game, just imagine like you're on trial for murder. Something's happened and you've been accused of it and you've been locked up and you're awaiting trial and it's going to go to trial. So you want to convince a jury that you didn't do this so you don't get punished for it. And further imagine that it's like one of these big murder cases that's in the news, so it's kind of out in pop culture, so people are talking about it and there's a lot of news coverage of it. And that means a lot of lawyers want to be your lawyer at this case because they know they're going to get famous off it, they're going to get book deals and interviews and all kinds of stuff. So you have a bunch of lawyers that want to be your lawyer. So while you're sitting in jail waiting for the trial to start, you get to have like open tryouts about which lawyer you want to choose. So as you're sitting there, you meet with 3 lawyers and you say, okay, lawyer number 1, what are you going to tell the jury to convince them that I didn't do this? And lawyer number 1 stands up and says, I'm going to tell them my client is innocent. And he sits down without saying anything else. Do you want that lawyer? Probably not. What has this lawyer accomplished? Well, he's done the first step. He gave an argument. He says, I'm going to tell the jury you should believe that my client is innocent. Well, okay. Well, that's an idea, but what he's missing is evidence. He's telling the jury, here, just believe this because I want you to. And a good juror hopefully would not believe that just because there's no evidence, just because the lawyer wants us to believe. So to get rid of that lawyer number 2, what do you got? So this lawyer says, I'm going to tell the jury that my client is innocent because fingerprints found at the scene prove that the killer is right-handed and wears a size 14 shoe. As if fingerprints could prove shoe size somehow. No, that's my mistake. But this lawyer's a little bit better. Has taken the first step, exact same argument, my client is innocent. And this lawyer takes another step, starts talking about some evidence in here. There's fingerprints that proves that the killer is right-handed, but hasn't done the third step of the body paragraph. Did not explain why the fingerprints prove and the right-handedness proves that you didn't do this. He just gave an argument and gave some evidence, but didn't explicitly tie the two together. So you don't want this lawyer. We want number 3, who says, I'm going to tell my client is innocent because he is left-handed, wears size 10 shoe, while fingerprints found at the scene prove that the killer is right-handed, wears different shoe size. Therefore, the evidence proves that my client is not the killer. And you need that third piece. You need to connect the evidence to the argument in your body paragraphs, because you don't want the jury trying to imagine for themselves what that connection is, because they might not make that connection, or they might make some other wacky connection, some idea that you don't really want them to. So in these arguments, you have to give the argument, give the evidence, and then explicitly, clearly tie the two together. And that's what this lawyer did. So that's the lawyer you want. And that's the kind of body paragraph that you want. And again, you can see this operating in the body paragraph I wrote on Washington. There's the argument in the beginning, then there's the long quote, then there's the explanation of the argument and how it ties to the evidence. All right. And next step is, since we're talking about evidence so much, in essays, you cannot just give some evidence. You have to tell the reader where you got that evidence from. And these are called citations. And generally there's 3 different major styles for citations, 3 different methods. The first is called MLA. It's taught in almost all the English classes in every college I've ever worked at because it's the easiest way to go. It stands for Modern Language Association, but I have to remember that. So MLA is often called parenthetical because, as you see in this slide, after the quote right in the middle, you just take a parentheses, write the author's last name, and then a page number, and then another parenthesis, and you're done. So this is often called the parenthetical style, named after these parentheses that are used. But you have to make sure that you get both the author's last name and the page number in those parentheses. You can't just give the last name. You can't just give a page number. There is a kind of weakness to this type of citation in that you're only giving the last name and a page number. That does not tell the reader who the author really is. There's a lot of people in the world running around named Washington that have written a lot of different books, over 50 some odd pages long. So you also need to have a bibliography at the end of this essay with the author's full name, the full title, where and when it was published, all that stuff, so that I, as the reader, can go find that book and look on page 56 and find this exact quote. So in this style, and all the other styles really, you need a bibliography. But this one especially, because you're not giving anything other than the author's last name and the page number in the citation itself. So that's the MLA style, or also known as the parenthetical style. And again, it's the easiest style because you only need that little bit of information, and you just put it in parentheses and you're done. You don't have to mess around with all those little numbers with the other styles. But we will get into those little numbers with the next style. All right. Here we see the same paragraph, same quote on the left, but at the end of the quote, kind of about, 2/3 of the way down, you'll see a little highlighted tiny number next to the end of the quote mark, the quotation closed mark. And that's a little number 1, because in this new style called endnotes, we're going to need numbers. So an endnote is exactly what it sounds like. You pop the little number 1 in at the end of the quote, and you go up to the top in your tab and you choose your references and you choose endnotes, and it'll create a last page of your essay that's called the endnotes page or the works cited page or something like that. And it'll generate a little number one for you on that last page in this slide on the right. And that's where you write the author's full name, the full title, publication data, where and when it was published and by who, the page number, really everything you need in your citation. So the numbers can be a little tricky to deal with, especially finding the place in your word processing program to add in the endnote. And another tricky thing is you want to start with number one with your first endnote, and after that, any that follow have to go in chronological numerical order. So the next quote, if you have another one later in the paragraph, like on this slide, if you look on the page on the left, there's another quote that got added to the paragraph, and from the third line from the bottom you see the end of the quote, and there's a little number 2 that's highlighted, and that number 2, when you create it, will correspond to number 2 in your endnotes page on the right side. So you have to make sure that your numbers go in order. You cannot reuse or recycle numbers. Once you use number 1, that's it. You're done. You go on to number 2. You cannot use number 1 again for your whole essay. It's done. It's used. So that's one common mistake that students make with endnotes and footnotes, is they try to recycle numbers, and you cannot do that because it gets really confusing for the reader. Even with this style, you still need a bibliography. So you still need a bibliography page at the end that lists all the sources that you used. So these are called endnotes because your citation appears at the end of the essay. So a lot of social sciences use endnotes, like psychology, sociology. History, though, doesn't. History prefers the third style, which is called footnotes. With footnotes, on this slide you see same original paragraph up at the top, same quote, and about 2/3 of the way down, the quote ends, and you see that same number, that little number you pop in there. But with footnotes, the citation appears at the bottom of the page or the foot of the page. And that's why we call them footnotes. And historians prefer footnotes because you'll notice this probably in any articles or book chapters you read that have endnotes. You'll notice that historians tend to cite a lot of stuff because we're really paranoid about being accused of plagiarism or being accused of not having enough evidence for our arguments. So historians tend to have citations like every 3 or 4 sentences. It's really pretty extreme. And as historians, we're reading each other's stuff. We don't like endnotes because it gets really annoying to have to flip to the back of the book and look up the citation every 3 or 4 sentences if we're interested. And we end up just kind of flipping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth a whole lot between the chapter and the end of the book to find the endnotes. So for historians, it's usually much easier to use footnotes. So we run into a citation and say, oh, where did they get that from? We just look at the bottom of the same page. So historians generally prefer using footnotes. And same thing as with endnotes. When you have another citation later in the page, like here on this slide, toward the bottom, the third line from the bottom, you'll see a highlighted blue little number 2. That's the next citation in line. And once you pop it in, you'll see a number 2 at the bottom, at the foot, in the footnote section appear. And again, historians sometimes, they have so many citations that you'll see the footnote section start climbing up the page. And sometimes the footnotes are like half the page, and that's fine. Sometimes even more, depending on how much that historian has to talk about their sources. So you may find that in the books and articles that you're researching for this term paper. But those are the 3 main citation styles. MLA, also known as parenthetical, and then we have endnotes, and the third is footnotes. And with any of those 3 styles, you need to have a bibliography page. And students often ask, which style should they use for their essay in this class, and I just tell them whichever one you feel most comfortable with. So what you do not want to do, though, is skip back and forth between different styles throughout your essay, because that gets confusing. So make sure that you pick one style for your essay and you stick with it the whole way through. All right, so for me personally, I don't like messing with footnotes and all these little numbers while I'm writing a rough draft. For me personally, it just feels like I'm getting bogged down and it takes too long to deal with all the numbers and citations and stuff. So when I'm writing a rough draft, I'll usually paste my quote in there, and then I'll make like a little in parentheses the author's last name and page number, and I'll highlight it because I'm a historian, so I have to use footnotes. So I highlight it to remind myself to later on, once the rough draft is all put together, to go back through and transition all of those kind of placeholder citations into footnotes. So usually I'll write a rough draft for a few hours, and then I'll take a few hours off, get something to eat or go for a walk or something just to get away from the computer, and I'll come back to the computer like later that night or something, and just spend an hour just popping in all the footnotes and making sure all the numbers line up and all that stuff. But I hate dealing with all those little numbers when I'm writing a rough draft because, again, psychologically, I like to feel like I'm just getting through it nice and easy, just breezing right through the rough draft, and I don't like to get bogged down in all these little numbers and details and whatnot. All right, so that's the big statement on citations. So for me, once I pop my citations into the rough draft, I mean, the draft is pretty much done. And then I have to figure out how I'm going to proofread the thing and look for errors and typos and problems in the draft. Because one big problem of getting into the detail of a rough draft that we've been talking about on this minuscule level of making sure that all the arguments line up with the thesis, and that my paragraph starts with an argument and then has a quote and explains the quote, and that the citations are all lined up the right way. A lot of times you get too close to it. You get into the minutia of it so closely that you lose sight of how the overall essay functions. And I like to use this example of all this math jargon on a chalkboard somewhere. I don't understand what any of this stuff means. But I'm willing to bet that if someone just obsessively worked on just one little equation on this whole chart, just one little piece of it, and worked on it day after day after day and made sure it's perfect, that they get so focused on that one little piece that they can lose sight of how it interacts with the whole rest of the chalkboard and all the other stuff on it. So the best way to kind of avoid that problem is to get really new eyes, fresh eyes on your essay, and get a person that hasn't been thinking about this stuff on this minute level to read it and look for errors. And we're going to do this in class through the rough draft peer review process, where you're going to exchange rough drafts with a partner and read each other's for targeted things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to go through proofreading real quick here. Two of the things I really look for when I'm grading your essay, your final draft, which means you should be looking for these as you're editing your rough draft and doing the peer review, are passive language and tense. So passive language is a big thing. No college I've ever seen, no English class has ever taught passive language, especially in community college, that I've ever noticed. So this is going to be brand new stuff for a lot of you, and a lot of you are probably going to really struggle with it and struggle to kind of wrap your mind around it. But passive language is really fairly simple. This is an example of passive language up here at the top. The marathon was won by Jose. Why is it passive? Because it means that something has happened to Jose. That means that Jose is like a passive recipient of the action. And that's why we call it passive language. Passive language is when someone like Jose, the actor in blue, is at the end of the sentence. That means that something happened to them or something was done by them. So that's kind of confusing. An easier way of saying that is just to flip it around and put the actor at the beginning. Just say Jose won the marathon. So just start your sentence off with the actor and then describe the action that they did. So instead of saying that this was done to them or this was done by them, just say they did it. And you can see by that example that the second sentence, the active sentence that starts with the actor and describes the action, is shorter and it's easier to understand because it just says Jose did this instead of this event happened to Jose. So that's a fairly simple example of passive language. The problem is that we're pretty much immersed in passive language. We speak in passive language on a daily basis. Movie characters speak in passive language. Reporters and politicians speak in passive language all the time. So we're really used to using passive language. And I don't really care if you use passive language in your everyday speech. I just don't want to see it in your essay. Because your essay should be written for clarity, to get the idea across to the reader as clearly and powerfully as possible. So we want to eliminate passive language from your writing. And one of the most famous movie characters that speaks in passive language almost constantly is Yoda from the Star Wars movies. So he's pretty extreme with it, but just some basic quotes like, failed I have. I mean, that's extremely passive. He should have started with himself and just said, I have failed. Or much to learn you still have. Whereas the actor is you, the person. So it should say you still have much to learn. And the last one is into exile I must go. So a lot of these sound kind of like romantic and kind of an interesting way of speaking, but it's confusing. And it's confusing in these tiny sentences that should say I must go into exile. Just start with the actor and describe what must happen or the action is going to happen. But these can be a little confusing in short sentences, but they can be very confusing in long sentences. So again, we often use passive language in our everyday speech, so it's a major problem when teaching people to write. This itself is a very passive, confusing statement. So for the next few minutes, under the next one, the next number on the worksheet, sit down and take a few minutes and try to figure out what is the actor in this sentence and how would you rewrite the sentence to make it active by putting the actor at the beginning and then just describing the action. So I'll give you a couple minutes, pause the video for a couple minutes until you write out your answer on your worksheet. Okay, so how'd you do? The actor in this is really difficult because a lot of people want to think that the actor is people or we because we're used to the actor being a person. But actually, in this sentence, passive language is the actor because that is what is causing all the action to follow. So the correct way is to start with passive language and say passive language is a major problem when teaching people to write because we often use it in our everyday speech. And use is really the action. And again, this is a very long and complex piece of passive language that I was asking you to deal with. But it also shows something very important about passive language, especially in long sentences, like the mistaken one up at the top. You start reading this. We often use passive language in our everyday speech, comma, so it's a major problem when teaching people to write. Why is that comma there? Commas are usually used for like giving a list of things. This happened and this and this and this and this and then it was done. But we have a comma right here in the middle of the sentence, and it's not a list of ideas. or options or anything like that. So why is that comma there? It's because just like we were taught in elementary school, you put a comma in where your brain wants to stop, where your brain takes a natural pause. And we start reading this sentence, we often use passive language in our everyday speech, and your brain wants to stop right there because this is so badly written that your brain wants to stop in order to try to figure out what's going on in this sentence. So you put a comma in. And then you read the rest of it. So it's a major problem in teaching people to write. And at that point, your brain has to, pause again and try to put the ideas in a logical order. So it's a very confusing sentence. But if you go with the second sentence, the one at the bottom that starts with the actor, passive language, you can go right through the whole sentence without pausing because it makes sense. You don't need a comma. Passive language is a major problem when teaching people to write because we often use it in our everyday speech. So you start with the actor, go through and describe the action and the problem, and it all flows. And you'll see passive language in even the major scholarly books that you're researching for this essay. Some historians have never been taught this passive language stuff, or even if they have, they've gotten lazy about it. Some historians are famous for using passive language all over the place. So you'll often find that even the highest level scholars working at the biggest name universities in the world, they're very bad at this passive language thing. So that's one reason that a lot of scholars are not very good writers. They're experts in their field. They've been studying their field for their whole lives, but they never learned how to write a very effective essay sometimes, especially with passive language. So you as introductory budding history students, we're going to try to knock that passive language out of your writing as much as possible. So what I'd like you to do for number 9 is to come up with your own passive language problem. So basically make the mistake, write one sentence that makes the mistake that uses passive language. And it doesn't have to be a real complex one like this everyday speech sentence. You can go back and do something more kind of simpler like the Jose won the marathon sentence. But what I want you to do is go back and write 2 sentences. The first one should make the mistake and the second one should correct it. So you're going to want to pause this video again while you write down your 2 sentences and restart it once you're done with that. And we're going to do another worksheet on passive language as you get closer to preparing to write your rough draft, just as a reminder of the different problems with passive language and how to fix it. Alright, so moving on. The last one we'll talk about is tense. So tense is very important in the history discipline because most of history talks about things that happened in the past tense. So the words that end with ed mean that they're in the past, they're over, they're done, they're concluded, they happened. And that's very different from things that are still ongoing now in the present. So present tense is below, it's happening, ing word. So because most of your essays are going to be about events that are done, are concluded, you want to stick with past tense for all of these verbs. So you want all of your words to say that people wrote ideas, people argued for things, people took action, people moved, people fought, people did whatever your essay is about. You do not want to write that they are doing these things, or they are fighting, or they are arguing, because most of your topics are in the past. They're not arguing anymore. They're not fighting. They're not moving. They're not arguing. They're done. So most of your topics will be in the past tense. For the modern world civ classes or the modern U.S. history classes or modern whatever that go all the way up till today in the timeline. Maybe you do have a topic that is ongoing, that is still unfolding, is still happening. In those rare instances, you can use present tense, but be very careful. All right, so here's some examples of stuff I've seen in student essays from the past. One student wrote an essay that talked about where Thomas Jefferson was living while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. So this is a big problem because Thomas Jefferson is not living anymore. He's dead. So he's not living, he's not writing, he's not doing anything anymore. He lived, he wrote, he did. So we want to get rid of that present tense. And in this instance, this is a really interesting kind of combination of past and present. Was implies in the past, but living implies in the present. So this is a kind of strange combination of present tense with past tense to try to get away with it. But it doesn't work because he's not living anymore. So how do we change this? You just change it to past tense and get rid of the was because you don't need it. So you want your essay to talk about where Thomas Jefferson lived while he wrote the Declaration. So again, I'll be looking for those ing words in your essay when I go to grade them. And a lot of students lose quite a few points if they have a lot of passive language and present tense to describe past events. But a lot of us speak this way, making the same mistake just in our everyday speech. And in fact, when I was getting ready to put this presentation together, this video together, I was in the kind of teacher break room one day in the building, and another professor walked in and said exactly this. I was having some car trouble while I was driving to work this morning. And I thought that was really funny because this supposedly highly educated person made the same mistake as the student did on their essay on Jefferson. Same exact thing, it's just in their everyday speech. So what's the problem here? It was having and was driving. I mean, those are present tense words for stuff that's in the past. So you want to get rid of that was having, which is, again, the exact same problem, the strange combination of was in the past, ing in the present, and you get rid of it to change it to all past tense. So you would prefer to say, I had some car trouble while I drove to work this morning. Because, you could get into a philosophical argument, are you still having car trouble while you're in the room with me talking about it? Possibly, you might be able to get away with that. But you're definitely not driving anymore because now you're in the break room talking to me. You're not in your car driving. So anything that happened a few seconds ago, a few minutes ago is in the past, if it's concluded. So you're not driving anymore, you drove. And for number 10, the very last one on the worksheet, I want you to go through and write one sentence, just like before, that makes the mistake. So write one sentence that uses present tense to describe a past event, and then write another sentence below it that fixes that problem, that changes it to past tense. So again, take a few minutes, maybe pause the video, and write down your answer under number 10. So again, watch out for those big differences between present tense and past tense because I'll be looking for those ing words in your final draft. And once you've really tried to find all these problems in your own rough draft, then we'll go on to the peer review, and these are the things that you're going to be asked to look for in each other's essays as you go through the peer review process and to point them out to your partner so that when you get the feedback on your own essay, you can find these problems in your own work and eliminate them and finalize your essay and turn in a final draft, and hopefully none of this stuff is in your final draft because you will have both caught it and fixed it by then. So for students that fix all these problems before the final draft gets to me, their final draft usually gets a pretty good grade. So that's really the whole process of researching and taking notes and building an outline, writing a rough draft, doing the citations. And really, the final step of a rough draft is to get someone to proofread it and look for a lot of these kinds of problems and fix them in editing. And at that point, you're ready to turn in your final draft. All right, now that the worksheet is done and we've gone through the whole thing, make sure that you turn in your worksheet through the assignments link, the file upload, and I'll get them graded and get the grades posted into your grades page.